Welcome to the second video to finish off October Part 1. You still have questions 4 and 5, what were stretched out on the long tables, and what did my thee say to Holly? On Wednesday, when we all stood up to go to Mr. Petrelli's geography class, Mrs. Baker stopped glaring. In fact, as we walked out with geography for you and me in our hands, she started to smile at me, and then I got worried. She looked like those evil geniuses who suddenly figure out a plan to conquer the world and can already imagine Earth's population quivering in their grasp. It was all I could do not to sprint out of Mrs. Baker's classroom, even though we weren't supposed to run in the halls, to the safe world of junior high geography. Mr. Petrelli believed that no class was worth having without a study question data sheet. He dittoed these off like a major publisher. His hands were always blue from the ink, mostly because he hauled the dittos out of the machine while they were still wet from the alcohol, the smell of which gave the room a tang. "Fill these out in pairs," he said. "You have 43 minutes. 43 minutes. Teachers do not reckon time the way normal people do, I think. When Merrill Lee came over to be my study partner, I was still wondering why Mrs. Baker had smiled. "Are you all right?" Merrill Lee asked. "Just swell." "You're holding your pen upside down." "Well, thanks for pointing that out, Detective Kowalski." "You're very welcome. Do you think you can figure out the answers while I write them down on the sheet?" "Why don't you figure out the answers while I write them down on the sheet?" "Because I know how to write. What's the first state?" "Delaware." "Do you think Mrs. Baker looks like an evil genius?" "Not unless you're paranoid. What's the second state?" "I'm not paranoid." "Pennsylvania." "Mrs. Baker hates my guts, you know." "Mrs. Baker doesn't hate your guts, and you are too paranoid. What's the third state?" "Well, thank you for your vote of confidence. New York." Merrill Lee looked over at geography for you and me. "New York wasn't the third state. It was New Jersey, not New York." "How do you know that?" "Everybody knows that," she said. Oh, out beyond Mr. Petrelli's not-so-clean lower windows, it was one of those perfect blue autumn days, when the sun is warm and the grass is still green and the leaves are red and tipped with yellow. A few white clouds drifted high, teased along by a breeze as gentle as a breath. "What's the fourth state?" said Merrill Lee. And that's pretty much how it went for Merrill Lee and me until recess, which had become a whole lot safer since Mrs. Baker's failed assassination plot. I figured that most of her would-be assassins had seen what had happened to Doug Switek's brother and were worried I might take them out too. So when we left Mr. Petrelli and went back to Mrs. Baker's classroom, I believed I could actually run out into the perfect October day and hope to come back alive. I could already feel the warm sun on my back. But then I found out why Mrs. Baker had been smiling. "Mr. Hoodhood," she called from her desk as the school clock clicked to noon, "I have a quick job for you. Everyone else enjoy your recess." I looked at Merrill Lee. "See?" I whispered. "You are paranoid," she said, and abandoned me. "Mr. Hoodhood," said Mrs. Baker, "there are some pastries that Mrs. Biggio has spent the morning baking for me, and they need to be brought up to this room. Would you go down to the kitchen and bring them here? And do not start any rumors. These are not for the class. They are for the wives of Vietnam soldiers gathering at St. Adalbert's this afternoon, not for anyone else." "Is that all?" I asked. "Don't look so suspicious," she said. "Suspicion is an unbecoming passion." So I took my unbecoming passion and left to find Mrs. Biggio. This didn't seem like it would take too long, even though grade 7 classrooms were on the 3rd floor and the kitchen was on the 1st floor at the very end of the hallway, probably so that the wind could blow the fumes away. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. When it didn't, the halls filled up with a scent of hamburger and pepper surprise, a scent that lingered like the smell of a dead animal caught underneath the floorboards. I think that Mrs. Biggio couldn't smell the scents, either because she wore a cotton mask over her face all the time, or because she had worked in the kitchen of Camillo Junior High for so long that she could no longer smell at all. But I didn't have a mask and I could smell, so when I reached the kitchen, I got ready to take a deep breath before I went in. But then I realized I didn't need to. There were no fumes. There was only the delicious, extravagant, warm, tasty scent of buttery baking crust, of vanilla cream, and of powdered sugar still drifting in the heated air. and stretched out on the long tables, far from whatever surprise was being fed to Camillo Junior High for lunch that day. Stretched out on those tables were a dozen trays of cream puffs, and that is number 4. They were brown, light, perfect cream puffs. "Mrs. Baker send you?" said Mrs. Biggio. I nodded. "You can start with that one," she said, pointing. I thought, in my head, in my heart, shouldn't Mrs. Biggio be grateful for my willingness to help? Wouldn't any human being with a beating heart hand me one of those brown, light, perfect cream puffs? Was it so unlikely? Yes, it was unlikely. "Now would be a good time to start," said Mrs. Biggio, "and don't drop any." "I won't drop any," I thought, "and you're welcome." I picked up a tray in each hand. "One tray at a time," said Mrs. Biggio. I looked at her. "That will take me 12 trips to the 3rd floor," I said. "So, Mr. Samowitz is Mr. Samowitz is teaching you some math after all. Don't drop any." So it took me the rest of lunch recess to carry the trays, one at a time, up to the classroom. Mrs. Baker smiled sweetly as I brought each one in. "Place them on the shelf by the windows. The cool air will keep them from getting soggy." I thought of my father, and I thought of the future of Hood and Associates architecture firm, and I did not complain. Even when Mrs. Baker asked me to open the windows a little wider, so I had to move all the trays one at a time again, so I could reach over the shelf and jerk all the windows open a little wider, I still did not complain. "Thank you," said Mrs. Baker as the school clock clicked to 12:30 and the classroom began to fill, and Danny Hupfer came to punch me on the shoulder because he thought the cream puffs might be for us, which they weren't. He figured that out when Mrs. Baker told us to get our Mathematics for You and Me books, line up by the door, and head to Mr. Samowitz's class. Now let me tell you, it is hard to care about set theory when there are 12 trays of brown, light, perfect cream puffs cooling deliciously on a shelf back in your own classroom. 12 sets of cream puffs divided by 23 kids plus Mrs. Baker meant half a set of cream puffs for every person in that room. And don't think we weren't all figuring out that equation. And don't think we are all worrying that Mr. Samowitz's homeroom class, who had just walked past us with English for You and Me in their hands, were trying to get their hands on the cream puffs. But they didn't. And when we came back in after math, the cream puffs were still there, cooling in the circulating air coming in beneath the clean lower windows. But Mrs. Baker acted like the cream puffs weren't there at all, and I suppose that in the end it really didn't matter that they were there. They may as well have already been over with the wives of Vietnam soldiers at St. Adalbert's already, for all the chance we had of getting one. When 1:45 came, half the class left, and Danny Hupfer whispered at me as he was leaving, "If she gives you a cream puff after we leave, I'm going to kill you," which was not something that somebody heading off to prepare for his bar mitzvah should be thinking. Then 1:55 came, and the other half of the class left, and Merrill Lee whispered as she was leaving, "If she gives you one after we leave, I'm going to do number 408 on you." I didn't remember what number 408 was, but it was probably pretty close to what Danny Hupfer had promised me. Even my Thee looked at me with narrowed eyes and said, "I know you're home." And that is number 5. Which sounded pretty ominous. But I knew I was safe. It was just as likely that President Lyndon B. Johnson himself would walk into the classroom as Mrs. Baker would give me a cream puff. And that is the end of October Part 1.